All right, so are you ready to unpack a life that I think is equal parts inspiring and complicated?
Oh, absolutely.
We've got excerpts here from two biographies about Winnie Madikizela-Mandela,
Hmm.
and I think she's someone who anyone who knows about South Africa and the fight against apartheid knows her name, but might not fully grasp just how complicated her story really is.
Yeah, and it's a story that I think brings up a lot of really tough questions
Oh, yeah.
about what people do when they're fighting for justice, and especially when they're fighting against a system as brutal as apartheid was.
Absolutely. To kind of set the stage, she was, of course, married to Nelson Mandela.
Right.
And while he was in prison for those 27 years, she became this really powerful voice in the movement, but her later actions caused a lot of controversy.
Yeah.
And so in this deep dive, we're going to explore both her activism and then also those moral gray areas, I think, to try to make sense of her legacy.
And what I think is really fascinating is that even before she met Nelson Mandela, Winnie was already deeply involved in activism.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
So she wasn't just Nelson Mandela's wife from the get-go.
Not at all. She was born Nomzamo Winifred Zeniwe Madikizela in 1936
Wow.
in Bizana in the Eastern Cape.
Okay.
And her parents were both educators, which is really significant, I think.
Because education was so key to advancement, even though, of course, the system was so rigged against Black South Africans.
Exactly. But what's really striking is how Winnie experienced that racial inequality firsthand from a very young age.
Yeah.
She talked about celebrating the end of World War II with her siblings
Uh-huh.
and how excited they all were to go to the town hall celebration with their father.
Oh, I can only imagine.
And when they got there, they were told it was for whites only.
Oh, wow.
Just imagine that this moment of, global joy,
Yeah.
and she's immediately confronted with this stark division.
What a gut punch, especially for a child. I mean, you can see how that would shape someone so early on.
Absolutely. It's that insidious nature of apartheid,
Yeah.
just permeating every aspect of life. And these early experiences, they really fueled Winnie's passion for social justice.
And that passion led her to Johannesburg to train as a social worker. And you can only imagine the things that she must have seen.
Oh, yeah.
Just the realities of apartheid playing out right there in front of her.
And remember, this is all before she even meets Nelson Mandela.
Yeah.
In 1958, she was already protesting the past laws, which were those laws that controlled where Black South Africans could live and work.
Yeah.
And she ended up getting arrested while she was pregnant.
Wow. So she was already putting herself on the line even then.
Oh, yeah, she was deeply committed.
That's incredible. And then in 1957, she meets Nelson Mandela, who at this point is a rising star in the ANC.
Right.
They marry a year later, and their lives take this incredibly dramatic turn.
It's also like their honeymoon period is cut short
Right?
by the realities of the struggle against apartheid.
Yeah.
Because Mandela's prominence is growing, and this is making him a target for the government.
Yeah.
And just 6 years after they get married, he's arrested and sentenced to life in prison.
Right. The Rivonia trial.
Exactly.
So Winnie's newly married and all of a sudden thrust into this incredibly difficult situation. What did that do to her own journey?
Yeah, how did she adapt to being the wife of a political prisoner?
Right.
Well, instead of shrinking back, Winnie stepped into the spotlight. And with Mandela imprisoned, she really becomes this symbol of resistance. And she takes on a much more public role.
Uh-huh.
But that also made her a huge target for the apartheid regime.
Oh, for sure. And we know about the constant harassment, the surveillance she faced, but what were some of the more specific hardships that she had to endure?
It was brutal.
Yeah.
I mean, she was subjected to banning orders.
Right.
So that was restricting her movements, her activities.
Yeah.
She spent over a year in solitary confinement, endured torture beatings.
Wow.
They even banished her to this remote town called Brantford
Yeah.
between 1977 and 1985.
It's hard to even fathom how she survived all of that. And then you add on top of that the betrayal of people she thought were her allies who turned out to be informants.
That's really one of the chilling aspects of her story.
Yeah.
It just shows how insidious the apartheid state was.
Right.
How they sowed distrust and paranoia,
Yeah.
even within the resistance movement.
Right.
Like there's the case of Gordon Winter,
Oh, yeah.
this journalist who befriended Winnie.
This is the guy who was secretly feeding information about her to the security forces, right?
The very same.
Wow.
He gained her trust and all the while was documenting her every move for the apartheid regime.
It's just a total betrayal that really speaks to the psychological toll that this fight must have taken on her.
Imagine constantly wondering who you could really trust,
Yeah.
who might be working against you in the shadows.
Right. It adds a whole other layer of complexity to the choices that she made later on.
Yeah.
And speaking of those, in 1985, She returns to Soweto amidst escalating unrest.
Right.
And that's when she forms the Mandela United Football Club. Yeah, this is where things get really complicated.
Yeah, this is where things start to take a darker turn.
Yeah, right. Because initially it was seen as a community group,
Yeah.
but then it very quickly became associated with violence and vigilantism.
Yeah.
And there's that really chilling quote that she gave about necklacing, which was the burning of people alive with tires and gasoline,
Right.
where she said, "With our boxes of matches and our necklaces, we shall liberate this country."
Mm.
What was the impact of that? How did that change people's perception of her, and what was the ANC's reaction?
Well, that statement sent shockwaves
Yeah.
through the anti-apartheid movement and beyond.
Right.
Some people saw it as this terrifying embrace of brutality.
Yeah.
But others who were caught up in the anger and desperation of the time,
Right.
they felt like it was a necessary response to the violence that they were facing.
Right.
And the ANC, who had initially supported Winnie, found themselves in a very difficult position.
They must have, yeah, I mean, caught between condemning the violence and acknowledging just how much pressure she was under.
Absolutely. It was a moral dilemma that highlighted the complexities of fighting a system like apartheid. I mean, do you condone violence even if it's in the name of liberation?
Right. Yeah.
Where do you draw the line? And these were questions that the ANC and the world were grappling with.
Yeah, and it all kind of came to a head with the abduction and murder of 14-year-old Stompie Sipe in 1988, allegedly by members of the Mandela United Football Club. This is the case that really cemented that controversy around Winnie.
It's a tragic story,
Yeah.
and it's impossible to separate it from Winnie's legacy.
Yeah.
She was acquitted of murder but convicted of kidnapping
Okay.
in connection with Sipe's death. And later, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was set up after apartheid to address past atrocities, found her politically and morally accountable
Right.
for the human rights abuses.
Committed by the football club.
Yeah.
So even years later, after apartheid had officially ended,
Right.
this case continued to haunt her.
It raises a really difficult question as we try to make sense of her legacy.
Yeah.
How do you weigh the immense suffering she endured, the sacrifices she made
Right.
against the violence that was committed in her name?
It's a question with no easy answers, and it's just one piece of the puzzle when it comes to understanding Winnie Madikizela-Mandela. There's
Right.
still so much to unpack about her life, her relationship with Nelson Mandela,
Yeah.
her role in post-apartheid South Africa.
Yeah.
But let's hold that thought for now.
Because the complexities of Winnie's story, they don't end with the fall of apartheid.
Right.
Her journey continued to unfold in ways that challenged people's perceptions of heroes and villains and everything in between.
Yeah.
So we left off with this really complex picture of Winnie, right?
Yeah.
Activist symbol of resistance, but also, a figure associated with violence, with controversy. And now we're entering this pivotal moment in South African history.
Yeah.
1990, Nelson Mandela is released from prison after 27 years.
Right.
It's this huge global celebration, and there's Winnie right by his side.
Yeah.
It must have felt like a vindication for her after everything she'd been through.
It was an incredibly symbolic moment.
Yeah.
I mean, the whole world was watching.
Right.
And this image of them together, reunited after decades of struggle,
Right.
it was powerful.
Incredibly powerful, but as we know, the reality of their relationship was much more complicated.
Yeah, things were definitely strained between them.
Yeah. They separated in 1992 and then divorced in 1996.
Right.
And it became this very public, very messy affair.
It did. And I think it really revealed just how much those years apart had strained their relationship.
Yeah.
You know, their experiences were so different.
Yeah.
And their approaches to the future of South Africa were also diverging.
You mentioned earlier that even before Mandela's release, there were those tensions between Winnie and the ANC regarding her tactics. Did those tensions kind of intensify during this transition to a post-apartheid South Africa?
They did, because you see, Nelson Mandela, upon his release, really championed forgiveness and reconciliation.
Yeah. He was focused on building this rainbow nation,
Yeah.
this unified South Africa that could move beyond the divisions of the past.
Right.
And Winnie, on the other hand, was much more critical of the compromises that were being made.
So while Mandela represented this vision of unity moving forward, Winnie felt like the wounds of apartheid were still very raw.
Exactly. She
Yeah.
felt that true justice hadn't really been achieved
Yeah.
for Black South Africans, and she was wary of the pace of change.
Right.
She believed that the transition was favoring the white minority
Hmm.
and wasn't really addressing the deep economic and social inequalities that apartheid had created.
It's hard to imagine how they could have really reconciled those very different
It
perspectives.
is, especially under the intense scrutiny that they were facing as global figures.
Right. And Winnie continued her political career even after the divorce.
She did.
What did that look like?
She stayed active in the ANC. She held various positions, even served as a member of parliament.
Okay.
But she was still a very controversial figure, often at odds with the party leadership.
I'm remembering that explosive interview she gave in 2010
Right.
with Nadira Naipal,
Uh-huh.
where she was incredibly critical of Mandela's legacy.
Right. In that interview, she reportedly accused Mandela of selling out black South Africans
Mm.
during the negotiations with the apartheid government
Wow.
and claimed that he was more of a figurehead,
Yeah.
kind of trotted out to appease the international community.
Right.
And that caused a huge uproar.
Yeah, within South Africa and internationally.
Absolutely.
It must have been difficult for many people who revered both Mandela and Winnie
Yeah.
to hear those contrasting views.
Yeah. And it was a stark reminder that the transition to democracy didn't erase the pain and anger of the past.
But I also understand that Winnie later denied giving that interview
She did.
and claimed that it was fabricated, but the
Okay.
damage was already done, I think.
It was that interview, regardless of its authenticity, really became a defining moment in her later years.
Yeah.
It cemented that image of her as this divisive figure who was unwilling to let go of the past.
And there were also those allegations of corruption swirling around her throughout her career.
Those allegations followed her for years. Yeah.
So we have this woman who is undeniably brave,
Oh, yeah?
who endured unimaginable hardships fighting against apartheid, but who also made choices that alienated many even within the movement that she dedicated her life to.
It's a complex and messy picture.
It is.
It reminds us that people are rarely just heroes or villains.
Right.
They're multifaceted,
Yeah.
capable of both great good and great harm.
And in Winnie's case, I don't think it's possible to ignore the impact of the trauma that she experienced.
Of course not.
The years of harassment, the imprisonment, the constant threat of violence. I mean, how could that not have left scars?
Absolutely. And it's something we have to consider when we evaluate her actions.
Mm.
It doesn't excuse them, but it helps us understand how someone who dedicated her life to fighting oppression could also become entangled in violence.
It's a tragic paradox, and it makes her story all the more challenging to unpack.
It does.
And then in 2018, she passes away, and there were, as you'd expect, mixed reactions to her death.
Of course.
Did her passing kind of reignite the debate about her legacy?
Absolutely.
Mm.
It forced South Africa and the world
Yeah.
to grapple with the totality of her life.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the good and the bad, the triumphs and the tragedies. And it sparked a new discussion about how to remember her,
Right.
how to reconcile these conflicting narratives.
I think our listener is probably wondering the same thing I am.
Yeah.
How do we judge Winnie Madikizela-Mandela?
Yeah.
Is it even possible to come up with a definitive answer?
It's a question that historians and commentators continue to debate.
Right.
And I don't think there is a simple answer,
Right.
but I think that's what makes her story so compelling, so relevant to us today. It challenges us to think about what heroism really is,
Yeah.
about the choices people make under extreme pressure, about the legacy of trauma and violence.
And it reminds us that history isn't just about memorizing facts and dates.
Right.
It's about engaging with these complex narratives,
Yeah.
wrestling with difficult questions, acknowledging the contradictions within individuals and movements.
Exactly. And in Winnie's case, those contradictions are particularly stark.
Yeah.
But I think grappling with them rather than shying away from them is essential.
Yeah.
If we really want to understand the history of the anti-apartheid struggle and the lasting impact of apartheid itself.
And maybe instead of trying to fit Winnie into this neat little box of hero or villain,
Right.
we can embrace those contradictions. We can acknowledge the courage, the resilience,
Yeah.
alongside the recklessness and violence.
Yeah. That's a powerful way to approach her story.
Yeah.
It allows us to see her as a fully realized human being,
Right.
someone who is both a product of her time and a force that helps shape it.
It's a reminder that even those who fight for just causes are still human,
Yeah.
capable of both great things and terrible things.
And I think that's a valuable lesson in itself.
Yeah.
It encourages us to be more nuanced in our judgments,
Right.
to recognize the complexities of human nature.
To acknowledge the lasting impact of trauma and oppression,
Right.
even on those who dedicate their lives to fighting against them.
Well said. Now, we focused a lot on Winnie as an individual,
Right.
but I'm curious to hear your thoughts on her role within the broader anti-apartheid movement.
Uh-huh.
It wasn't a monolithic entity, right?
You're right.
There were different factions, different approaches to achieving liberation.
Absolutely. The anti-apartheid movement was incredibly diverse, with a wide range of viewpoints and strategies.
Right.
And Winnie, with her increasingly militant approach,
Yeah.
represented a particular strand within that movement.
So within this really diverse landscape of the anti-apartheid movement, where did Winnie's approach fit in?
Well, that's a really important question.
Yeah.
And while, Winnie's embrace of militancy and her confrontational tactics were controversial,
Right.
it's important to remember that she wasn't alone in her beliefs.
Right.
There were others within the movement who felt that the ANC's commitment to nonviolence was too passive.
And that a more forceful approach was needed.
Yeah, especially after experiencing the brutality of the system firsthand.
Exactly.
The harassment, the imprisonment. I mean, it's understandable that some would feel that nonviolence just wasn't enough.
Exactly. And remember, the ANC itself wasn't immune to internal debate.
Right.
And criticism there were those who felt that the leadership was too willing to compromise, too focused on appeasing the white minority government.
So in a way, Winnie embodied that dissenting voice.
Right.
The frustration, the anger of those who felt that a more radical approach was needed.
Yeah, I think that's a really insightful way to put it.
Yeah.
She became a lightning rod for those feelings,
Mm-hmm.
a symbol of defiance and resistance, particularly in the 1980s,
Right.
when South Africa was really teetering on the brink of civil war.
And that's where the Mandela United Football Club comes in, right?
Right.
It operated outside the traditional structures of the movement,
Yeah,
almost like this paramilitary force within the townships.
it did. And that's where things get really messy.
Yeah.
I mean, it's clear that the group was formed with good intentions,
Right.
to provide a sense of community and protection in a very volatile environment.
Right.
But it very quickly descended into violence and vigilantism.
And it's those actions,
Yeah.
the violence committed in the name of the MUFC,
Right.
that are so difficult to reconcile with the image of Winnie as this freedom fighter.
Right.
I mean, how do we even make sense of that contradiction?
It's a question that I think people continue to debate, and I don't think there's an easy answer.
Yeah.
But it's important to consider the context of that time.
Right.
The extreme pressure, the fear that permeated the townships.
Yeah.
I mean, the apartheid regime was cracking down so brutally on any form of dissent.
Right.
And there was this feeling that the country was on the verge of imploding.
So Winnie and the MUFC were operating in this pressure cooker where violence seemed almost inevitable.
Yeah. And again, that's not to excuse the violence that they committed.
Right.
But it's crucial to understanding the choices that they made.
Yeah.
And you also have to consider the psychological impact of that constant threat of violence.
Yeah.
The trauma that Winnie herself had endured.
Of course.
I mean, it's not hard to see how someone in that situation might become desensitized to violence, might see it as the only way to fight back.
It's a cautionary tale, isn't it?
It is.
That even those fighting for just causes can be corrupted by violence.
Right.
Can become the very thing that they're fighting against.
Yeah, it highlights the complexities of these movements.
Yeah.
The internal tensions, the ethical dilemmas that arise when people are pushed to their limits.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Winnie's life,
Yeah.
I think our listener is left with a lot to consider.
They are.
There's no easy way to sum up her legacy. No simple judgment to be made.
Right. Her story is this tapestry of contradictions, of light and shadow, of heroism and tragedy.
Yeah.
It's a story that challenges us to think about the nature of leadership,
Uh-huh.
about the use of violence when you're pursuing justice,
Right.
about the lasting impact of trauma and oppression.
And I think the fact that we're still debating her legacy, even years after her death, speaks volumes.
I agree.
Yeah, it shows that her story continues to resonate with us.
Yeah.
That she remains this really powerful and provocative figure.
Absolutely. And I think ultimately that's what makes history so compelling.
Right.
It's not just about memorizing dates and names.
Yeah.
It's about engaging with the complexities of the past, wrestling with these difficult questions,
Right.
acknowledging the contradictions within ourselves and the world around us.
Well said. And on that note, I want to leave our listener with one final thought. We talked a lot about the impact of apartheid on Winnie's life.
Right.
But It's equally important, I think, to consider the impact that Winnie had on the struggle against apartheid.
Yeah.
I mean, what would the movement have looked like without her fierce voice,
Yeah.
her unwavering commitment, her willingness to push those boundaries, even if it meant crossing lines that others wouldn't?
That's an excellent point.
Yeah.
And while her tactics were often controversial,
Yeah.
there's no denying that she played a crucial role in galvanizing resistance,
Yeah.
in keeping that spirit of defiance alive, particularly during those long years when Mandela was imprisoned.
She was a symbol of hope, for many a reminder that even in the darkest of times, the fight for freedom has to continue.
She was a force to be reckoned with,
Yeah.
a woman who refused to be silenced, who challenged the status quo, and whose legacy, for all its complexities and contradictions, will continue to inspire and provoke for generations to come.
And that concludes our deep dive into the life and legacy of Winnie Madikizela. Mandela, thank you for joining us on this journey.